Okay, let's unpack this. Today we're diving into a really specific and, influential perspective on global trade. We've pulled a stack of insights from Robert Lighthizer book No Trade is Free.
And he's someone whose fingerprints are, well, they're all over U.S. trade policy for decades, right?
Yeah.
From the Senate into the Reagan administration, and then most recently, of course, as the U.S. trade representative under President Trump.
Exactly. So our mission in this deep dive is really to explore his view on globalization, how he sees international trade systems like the WTO functioning, and, the significant changes his administration pursued, particularly regarding China and big trade deals like NAFTA.
Yeah, it's definitely a perspective that challenges some pretty long-held beliefs about free trade. And it puts the focus squarely back onto American workers and domestic industry. You're going to get some surprising facts, maybe, and see trade policy through a very particular lens. A very important one, though.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning then. Where does this skepticism about traditional trade policy really come from for Lighthizer? It seems pretty deep-rooted.
Well, his background is definitely key. He started out in trade law, working in the Senate. Then he worked in the Reagan administration, specifically on trade. And after that, he spent a lot of time in private practice, actually representing U.S. manufacturers, the ones facing tough competition from imports. So by the time, say, 2010 rolled around, he was already known in Washington as a major skeptic of China, yes, but also the whole international trade system as it had developed.
Right, and he wasn't just, mildly skeptical. He was actively arguing against what he called Washington's, quote, one-sided free trade agenda, an agenda he saw taking root way back in the 1980s.
That's absolutely right. And this really sets up his central argument, which is this tension between theoretical free trade and what he calls practical fair trade. He even brings in historical figures like Henry Clay and his American System back in 1832, arguing trade has to be fair, equal, and reciprocal.
So this idea of free trade as some pure, untouchable ideal, he basically calls it a unicorn.
Precisely. Something that doesn't really exist in practice, or at least isn't practiced by other major economies. He even traces this back to early U.S. policy. People like Hamilton and Clay, they used tariffs for revenue, sure, but also specifically to build up domestic manufacturing. And that was the dominant Republican view, he argues, from Lincoln right up until the 1930s, before the big shift towards reciprocal agreements, and eventually the GATT system after World War II.
Interesting. And his time in the Reagan administration sounds like it was really formative for him. He worked on those voluntary restraint agreements, the VRAs, on steel and cars.
Yes, exactly, with countries like Japan. And that's where he says he learned really firsthand how crucial leverage is in trade negotiations. He argues the key was having that credible threat to act unilaterally to impose tariffs. Without that threat, he felt, you couldn't get other countries to address their unfair practices or agree to limit exports. You needed that stick.
It's funny you mentioned Reagan because he notes Reagan himself was criticized back then by some free traders, called the most protectionist president since Herbert Hoover.
Right, and Lighthizer apparently took that as a compliment, which tells you a lot about his whole approach, doesn't it? So this whole history, these experiences, seeing what he thought worked and what didn't, it all directly fueled his motivation for taking the USTR job under Trump.
He saw it as a real chance then to fight for a trade policy that was explicitly aimed at helping American workers.
Exactly. Especially he emphasizes those without college educations.
Yeah.
And he connects it very personally to watching his own hometown, Ashtabula, Ohio, decline as manufacturing jobs disappeared. He talks about seeing hopper cars stop bringing iron ore, industries drying up.
Okay, so let's dig into those consequences then. What specific negative impacts does the book highlight as really driving this perspective?
Well, one really stark figure he uses is the loss of nearly 5 million U.S. manufacturing jobs just between 2000 and 2016. Now, he does acknowledge that, automation and other factors played a part, but he really emphasizes the huge impact, maybe the primary impact, of offshoring driven by these trade policies.
And the book connects that job loss to much wider societal problems, right? Like stagnant incomes.
Yeah, stagnant median household income over that same period. And he links it, controversially perhaps for some, to the rise in what are sometimes called deaths of despair. Things like cirrhosis, suicides, drug overdoses, particularly hitting non-college educated middle-aged white adults. He argues this even contributed to a dip in overall U.S. life expectancy for a time, which is pretty rare for a developed country.
Wow. Okay, so that's the jobs picture. What about the trade deficit? That's another big focus for him.
Oh, absolutely. A major focus. And he's not just talking about, a temporary imbalance with one country here or there.
Yeah.
He's concerned about the persistent huge structural deficits the U.S. runs with the entire world year after year.
He gives some pretty specific examples, too, doesn't he?
He does, like 50 straight years of deficits with Japan, massive deficits with China, obviously, growing ones with parts of Europe, Germany, Ireland. He even points out how reliant some smaller economies like Vietnam have become on exporting to the U.S., something like 27% of Vietnam's GDP coming from sales to America.
And how does he frame that? Why is that long-term deficit such a problem in his view?
He basically likens it to a household having to take out a second mortgage every single year just to cover its bills.
Right.
You're financing consumption by selling off assets, land, companies, intellectual property. He argues that's just not a sustainable path for maintaining national wealth in the long run.
Okay, so deficits are a major concern. What about the free trade agreements, the FTAs that were supposed to, help balance things out?
Well, he's pretty critical of those too. He argues they often failed America's interests, particularly workers' interests. The basic problem, as he sees it, is the U.S. granted access to its massive market by lowering tariffs. And sure, that led to more imports coming in, but the promised reciprocal boom in U.S. exports often didn't materialize on the same scale.
And why not, according to him?
Because, he argues, other countries kept using unfair tactics. Things like currency manipulation, big government subsidies for their key industries, and all sorts of subtle non-tariff barriers designed to block U.S. goods. And he says the FTAs just weren't effective at addressing or enforcing rules against those kinds of practices.
He points to specific tariff differences, right? Like with the EU on cars.
Yeah, he mentions the EU's 10% tariff on imported cars versus the US's 2.5%, or higher EU tariffs on things like wine and processed wood. Small examples, but indicative of a pattern, he suggests.
And this connects to his point about value-added taxes, VATs. That seems like a more technical point.
It is, but he thinks it's really important. He explains that the average EU VAT, around 21%, essentially functions as a border-adjusted tax. So, from his perspective, when goods come into the EU, they face this VAT. But when goods are exported from the EU, that VAT is rebated.
So it acts like an import tax and an export subsidy?
That's how he sees it, effectively.
Mm.
U.S. goods face this extra hurdle going into Europe, while European goods coming here don't face a comparable federal tax, just our lower state sales taxes, which vary.
Interesting. Now, economists might argue exchange rates adjust for that, right?
They do. He acknowledges that debate. Economists often say currency adjustments should neutralize the VAT effect over time. But he counters that real business people, the ones actually trying to sell stuff, consistently see the VAT as a significant practical disadvantage for U.S. exporters on the ground.
Okay, let's talk NAFTA. That gets a particularly strong critique in the book.
Oh, absolutely. He pulls no punches there. Describes NAFTA basically as a ripoff for American workers. He points to the numbers. The U.S. had a small trade surplus with Mexico right before NAFTA fully kicked in, around 1994. By 2016, that had flipped to a huge deficit.
And he cites specific research on job losses.
Yeah, he mentions work by economist Robert E. Scott, which identified industries hit hardest like electrical machinery, motor vehicles and parts, textiles, apparel, lumber.
Echoing Ross Perot's old warning about the giant sucking sound.
Pretty much, yeah. The perspective presented is that NAFTA wasn't really about balanced trade benefits. It was maybe more about protecting U.S. companies investing in Mexico. And its negative impact, he argues, was amplified because it happened right around the same time China joined the WTO. So American workers got squeezed from both sides, competing with lower-wage Mexican labor and heavily subsidized Chinese labor simultaneously.
So Mexico's success in areas like auto manufacturing wasn't just market forces in this view.
No, he argues it was driven by policy choices, government incentives, maybe currency factors, distortions, not Adam Smith's invisible hand.
Okay, and then there's the WTO itself, the World Trade Organization. He argues it, and particularly its appellate body, failed America. How so?
Well, the promise, when the U.S. helped create the WTO, was that it would provide a level playing field. It would give the U.S. tools to discipline countries using unfair trade practices, especially looking ahead to problems with China. But instead, he argues, the result was exploding trade deficits, particularly with China, and the WTO's appellate body actually ended up, in his view, enabling China's state-led model rather than constraining it.
He calls the appellate body an unelected lawmaking body. That's strong language.
It is. He argues it basically overstepped its mandate. It started creating its own precedents, like a court, which wasn't really intended, and crucially, it repeatedly ruled against U.S. anti-dumping and anti-subsidy measures.
Those are the tools the U.S. uses to fight back when foreign companies sell goods below cost or get unfair government help, right?
Exactly. So his argument is the appellate body's rulings effectively neutered those tools, making it much easier for foreign companies, especially Chinese state-backed ones, to dump subsidized products into the U.S. market, which then hurt American industries.
He mentions specific cases.
Yeah, he brings up things like the controversial tuna dolphin cases, where he says the WTO rulings went against U.S. environmental and safety laws, showing its willingness to kind of intrude on domestic regulations.
Okay, so that lays out a pretty comprehensive critique of past policies and institutions. How does the book then describe the shift in approach when he became USTR during the Trump administration?
Well, like you said, his stated goal going in was crystal clear. Implement a trade policy focused on American workers, driven by what he saw happen to industrial towns.
And certainly candidate Trump's rhetoric on trade deficits, China, NAFTA, that resonated with a lot of working-class voters.
Absolutely. The book frames the administration's strategy as a return to principles that, in Lighthizer's view, had been unwisely abandoned under the sort of WTO consensus. Things like not just letting adversaries like China automatically benefit from open access to the huge U.S. market without real reciprocity, using that market access as serious leverage in negotiations, explicitly seeing trade policy as a tool to shape the domestic economy you want, and importantly, being willing to act unilaterally if needed outside the WTO process.
And China became the absolute central focus, it seems.
Yes. Described as the main adversary militarily, diplomatically, and economically, he argues granting China most favored nation trading status was a fundamental mistake, and that the massive trade deficit, those hundreds of billions flowing to China each year, effectively helped finance China's military buildup and its global initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI.
How is the BRI viewed in the book? Positively.
Not at all. It's viewed pretty critically as a tool China uses to gain geopolitical leverage by trapping developing countries in debt and creating dependency. He gives examples like Pakistan staying quiet on the treatment of Uyghurs despite its large Muslim population, or Malaysia seeming to align with China's claims in the South China Sea, potentially due to economic ties or pressure from BRI projects.
He goes into quite a bit of detail on China's economic system itself.
He really does. Describes it as a state-driven, mercantilist system. Huge role for state-owned enterprises, SOEs, massive government subsidies, requirements for foreign companies to transfer technology just to get market access, industrial espionage, rampant intellectual property theft.
The numbers on IP theft are pretty staggering. He estimates U.S. losses over $300 billion annually.
Yeah, potentially over $300 billion a year, and he suggests China could be responsible for maybe 80% of that total global IP theft, just a huge strain.
He also notes a change in tone under Xi Jinping.
Yes, he perceives a shift towards more overt confrontation, more assertiveness. He points to language Xi used in reports, like to the 20th Party Congress, suggesting a more Marxist-Leninist, state-controlled, and militaristic direction. Even phrases like preparing for the storm.
And he argues you can see the results of these policies in China's dominance in certain key industries now.
Exactly. Solar cells are a prime example he uses. China now makes something like 78% of the world's supply. The U.S. used to have like 45% back in 1995. That's a huge shift. And shipbuilding China builds over 1,000 large ocean-going ships a year, the U.S. fewer than 10. He argues these aren't natural market outcomes. They're the direct result of decades of targeted state support and intervention by China.
So faced with all that, what tools did the administration use? You mentioned unilateral action.
Right. A key move was dusting off and using Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974. This is a powerful tool that allows the U.S. to investigate and respond to foreign trade practices deemed unfair or harmful to U.S. commerce. It was aimed specifically at China's systemic issues, not just one-off disputes.
How did that work in practice? What was the process?
Well, basically, USTR conducted an investigation into China's practices related to intellectual property and technology transfer. They concluded these practices were harming U.S. businesses. Based on that finding, they imposed tariffs. First, 25% tariffs on about $50 billion worth of Chinese imports, targeting goods linked to China's own industrial plans like Made in China 2025.
And then China retaliated, right? So it escalated.
They did retaliate, yes. which led to further rounds of U.S. tariffs. Another $200 billion worth of Chinese goods hit with tariffs, initially 10%, later raised to 25%, and then eventually tariffs on another, roughly $75 billion, starting at 15%, also raised later. He makes the point that China started to run out of ammunition for retaliation because they import less from the U.S. than the U.S. imports from them.
Were there other measures alongside the tariffs?
Yes, definitely. They also tightened restrictions on Chinese investment in sensitive sectors within the U.S. and strengthened export controls on certain strategic technologies going to China. The idea was a multi-pronged approach to pressure China economically and protect America's technological edge.
Okay, what about the actual negotiations with China? A book talks about the Phase 1 deal.
Right. He describes those talks as incredibly complex, very high-level, highly choreographed. Mentions some unusual moments, like him giving an impromptu speech directly to President Xi in Beijing. A big focus in those talks was trying to address the structural issues in China's economy subsidies, forced tech transfer, IP theft, and crucially, setting up some kind of enforcement mechanism that worked outside the WTO system, figuring out who decides if China breaks the rules and how the U.S. could retaliate directly.
Did they make progress on things like IP protection in that Phase 1 deal?
They did secure some commitments from China on intellectual property, though he acknowledges some of the really tough issues, like protecting biologic drug data or stopping cyber intrusions for commercial gain, were kind of pushed off to future phases that never happened. He also notes China consistently pushed hard for the U.S. to remove the tariffs as part of any deal, and they tried to link the trade talks to other issues, like U.S. policy towards Hong Kong, which the U.S. side resisted.
Okay, let's shift gears again back to North America. Renegotiating NAFTA into the USMCA was another huge effort.
Absolutely. And the stated goal there was explicitly to replace NAFTA with what the book calls a worker-focused agreement. Very different emphasis. Key objectives were things like strengthening the rules of origin, the rules determining how much of a product has to be made in North America to qualify for duty-free treatment, specifically to encourage more manufacturing to come back. Also, adding much stronger enforceable labor and environmental standards. Getting rid of the controversial corporate arbitration system known as ISDS, where companies could sue governments directly, and adding sunset clauses so the deal would have to be reviewed periodically.
And leverage was a factor here too, even with allies like Canada and Mexico.
Yes, definitely. He mentions the controversial use of Section 232 national security tariffs on steel and aluminum imports from Canada and Mexico. He presents this as necessary signaling, showing that it wasn't business as usual anymore, and that the administration was willing to ruffle diplomatic feathers, as he put it, to get the deal they wanted.
That must have made for some pretty tense negotiations.
Oh, incredibly tense, by his account. It involved tough talks with both Canada and Mexico, naturally, but also really significant back and forth with stakeholders inside the U.S. Congress, powerful labor unions. He details specific sticking points, like ensuring Mexico actually implemented promised labor law reforms, setting up timelines for things like independent union elections and new contracts, and the rapid response mechanism, which allows for quick action against specific factories violating labor rights, was apparently a key piece negotiated heavily with Democrats in Congress quite late in the game, and then presented to Mexico.
Interesting. The book also mentions dropping a provision on biologic drug data exclusivity.
Yes, that was a provision the pharmaceutical industry wanted, providing longer market exclusivity for certain biologic drugs. It was in early drafts, but ultimately got removed from the final USMCA text. He attributes that to domestic U.S. political dynamics during the congressional approval process.
So despite all that friction and controversy, how does he ultimately portray the USMCA?
He presents it as a major success, a gold standard, he calls it, for future trade agreements. He highlights the strong bipartisan support it eventually received in Congress, arguing it created a much stronger foundation for North American trade, precisely because it prioritized workers' interests over just corporate efficiency, even if the process was, well, diplomatically challenging.
Okay, so that brings us towards the end. Looking forward, based on this perspective laid out in the book, what's the proposed path forward for U.S. trade policy?
Well, he draws an interesting comparison with Japan back in the 70s and 80s. He notes that China's rise using industrial policy, forced tech transfer, closing off markets, maybe currency manipulation, echoes some of Japan's tactics back then. But Japan's economy eventually slowed after its asset bubble burst, and importantly, the U.S. implemented policies back then to help its own industries compete more effectively. He suggests this history supports the idea that a strategic decoupling from China, at least in key strategic sectors, combined with strong domestic policies to boost U.S. production, can actually work. It's not an impossible task.
So that leads to a pretty clear policy prescription then.
It really does. He argues for a fundamental shift in how the U.S. thinks about trade. We need to see ourselves not just as consumers looking for low prices, but also as producers needing good jobs and strong industries. So things like pure economic efficiency, the lowest possible consumer prices, maximizing corporate profits, those should become secondary goals. The primary goal should be improving the lives, wages, and opportunities for American working people. Trade policy, in this view, becomes an active tool to achieve national goals, promote the common good, not just let the market dictate everything.
Does he suggest specific actions to achieve that?
Yes, several. Using strong rules of origin, like in USMCA, to deliberately pull manufacturing back to North America, or ideally the U.S. itself. He mentions advanced battery production as a prime example. He also proposes using heavy tariffs, maybe on lower-end high-tech goods like laptops, to actively incentivize companies to move that production out of China, either back to the U.S. or at least to allied countries, and pursuing a more deliberate strategic decoupling from China, especially for national security reasons, making sure critical things like drones, for example, are made here or by trusted allies without relying on Chinese components.
What about the WTO in this future vision? Does it have any role?
A limited one, in his view. He thinks the WTO can still be a useful forum for talks with other democratic market-based economies on things like technical standards, maybe coordinating on subsidies. But its structure, especially the need for consensus among all members, makes it basically useless for tackling the big systemic problems posed by China's state-run economy. He argues you just can't get agreement there, so the U.S. needs to remain willing to act unilaterally, or maybe form coalitions with like-minded countries when necessary. He even floats a radical idea, maybe a global reset of tariff levels to a new baseline, based on the average tariffs currently applied by industrialized nations.
He also flags one very specific technical loophole he thinks needs closing urgently, the de minimis rule.
Ah, yes, the $800 threshold. This is the U.S. rule that allows packages valued at $800 or less to come into the country completely duty-free and with very little customs inspection. He argues this threshold is way too high compared to other countries, and it allows literally billions of dollars worth of goods. He cites an estimate of $128 billion just in 2021 to flow into the U.S. largely unchecked.
And the problems with that are?
Well, several. First, it makes it incredibly hard to police what's coming in. Things like counterfeit products or even illicit drugs like fentanyl precursors can slip through more easily in these small packages. Second, there's a lack of reciprocity. Other countries have much lower thresholds. Canada's is around $150 Canadian, Mexico's $50 US, the EU is $150, China's is tiny, like 50 RMB.
So U.S. sellers face duties and hurdles sending small packages abroad, but foreign sellers sending them here under $800 get a basically free pass.
Exactly. He argues it's a huge disadvantage for U.S. domestic retailers and manufacturers who have to compete against these duty-free imports, often from companies like Shein or Temu operating largely from China. He sees this policy as purely driven by lobbying from big import-reliant businesses and argues it's incredibly damaging and absolutely has to be changed, lowered significantly.
It sounds like reversing all these trends, the deficits, the job losses, the reliance on China, would be a massive long-term undertaking, though.
Oh, he definitely acknowledges that. You can't undo decades of policy overnight. It requires careful planning, phasing things in to avoid major economic disruptions. But his counter-argument is that delaying action only makes the problems worse, the imbalance is deeper, and the eventual fix potentially harder and more costly.
Does he sound optimistic that this kind of shift is actually possible or gaining traction?
Somewhat, yes, despite the challenges. He points to what he sees as a growing bipartisan consensus in Washington on the need to be tougher on trade, particularly with China. Cites polling data showing strong public support across party lines for things like tariffs on Chinese goods and taking action to counter unfair practices. His view seems to be that the ideas in his book, which might have seemed radical or protectionist just a decade ago, are actually becoming much more mainstream, maybe even common sense now.
So wrapping up, the core message really comes back to that title, doesn't it? No trade is free.
Exactly. It's all about trade-offs. He forces you to confront them. Cheaper consumer goods might mean fewer domestic jobs or lower wages for some workers. More imports inevitably mean less domestic production in those sectors. And persistent large trade deficits, year after year, he argues, ultimately mean a decline in national wealth and power over the long term. There are always costs, even if they aren't immediately obvious on the price tag. His reflection is that the Trump administration, where he served, really initiated a significant, maybe historic shift by putting jobs and wages back at the center of trade policy, even if that rebalancing act is far from complete.
Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting for you, the listener. We've just taken a deep dive into a very specific, very influential perspective that fundamentally reframes the whole debate around trade policy. It moves away from abstract theories of, pure free trade and focuses instead on the tangible results for American workers, for domestic industries.
Yeah, we looked at how past decisions, institutions like the WTO, big deals like NAFTA, are viewed through this particular critical lens, how they're argued to have led to job losses, maybe even societal stress. And then we explored the different, more confrontational and strategic approach taken more recently, especially regarding China and the effort to reshape North American trade with USMCA.
So this deep dive really leaves us with a pretty big question for you to think about. If it's true, as Lighthizer argues, that no trade is free, meaning there are always costs, always trade-offs, then what specific goals should guide U.S. trade policy going forward? And maybe more importantly, who or what should be the main beneficiary of that policy in the end? Something to chew on.